Welcome to our future viewers. My name is Bill Hart. I'm a professor of religious studies and American studies at Macalester College. Here today to have a conversation with Frank B. Wilderson III. Professor Wilderson is at University of California-Irvine, where he's a professor of drama and African American studies. He's published in numerous journals. He's also published 3 books, including his memoir, Incognegro. His second book is Red, White, and Black. There's a copy of it here. And the book that we're here to talk about today is Afropessimism. So I have a series of questions that I want to ask Professor Wilderson. I've pre-circulated these questions to him because I don't believe in ambushing people. I like people to have a chance to think about the questions that I'm going to ask because I really am genuinely interested in what they have to say. So, Frank, if I may call you that, would you mind giving us an overview of the concept of Afropessimism and how you came to explore that concept in relation to your lived experience?
Well, yes, thank you very much. And it's really good to be with you. You prefer Bill or William?
Bill is fine.
Oh, okay. I know where you are because, of course, I grew up right across the river in Minneapolis. And, you know, my dad was on the board of Macalester and my uncle was an administrator there. And my cousin went there. So, and there's a bookstore that I think I used to frequent called Hungry Mind, is it?
Yes.
Yes. So, I don't know a lot about St. Paul because I spent all my time in Minneapolis, but I know that area pretty well. So I'm glad to be with you. I think the first thing to say about Afropessimism is that there are kind of similarities in the concerns that it has to the structural dynamic of, say, Lacanian psychoanalysis as that structural dynamic is manifest in radical revolutionary feminism and the structural dynamic of Marxism as it is manifest in revolutionary political thought. All 3 of Afropessimism, Lacanian political theory, and Marxist political theory are really concerned with things that a lot of people who are activists on the ground don't necessarily talk about, but that is the notion of political ontology. In other words, what are the capacities, the first principles, and the schematic structuring of a political subject? And precisely, how does that subject suffer? Now, so there's a way in which Afropessimism emerges as a critical theory through a meta-interrogation of the assumptive logic of those 2 large domains of thought. It is not organic to the thinking of David Marriott or Saidiya Hartman or Frank Wilderson or Jarrett Sexton or Zakiya Iman Jackson or a host of other people, because I would like to think that what we are very, very large ear trumpets who have listened to the symptoms of Black speech when it comes to suffering, what it means to suffer, without attaching our ear to that Black speech with respect to how we get over that suffering. So in other words, a lot of people think that, I'm putting this out there first because the grand narratives of liberation always come to us with 2 rhetorical gestures. There is in Lacan, the description of the unconscious and how it suffers. And then if you kind of like concentric circles go out like that, you find that a Lacanian analysis will suggest that the corruption of the kinship structure. How is the kinship structure corrupted? It is corrupted because it is mapped over by Oedipus. And that mapping of Oedipus onto a kind of what what Lacanians would think of and Levi Strauss followers would think of as an organic and universal entity, which is kinship, something that belongs to everyone. So the revolutionary gesture of prescription is to destroy Oedipus as a way of mapping the relations of kinship. For Marx, it would be to destroy capitalist accumulation and the parasitic processes of exploitation and alienation that produce value in the way that he has finally articulated what value is, and to destroy that, and then to remap an egalitarian narrative or thematics onto economy. What we have argued is not that we're nihilists and don't want a vision of the future, but our interrogation is actually not of the ways in which kinship has been corrupted, not of the ways in which political economy has been corrupted, but an interrogation of the capacity to make world full stop. In other words, that whether you bring about if you are a Lacanian feminist revolutionary and you destroy the two oppressive categories of man and woman, and you articulate, for example, a transgender modality that remaps kinship, moving through Orlando Patterson and others, and the moments of Fanon that we feel he cannot always look at, we argue that it's actually the capacity for kinship which is parasitic on the slave, not a certain kind of kinship. If you get from capitalism to communism, we would argue that's a better world, but we still have world-making capacity, and world-making capacity generically, regardless of whether it's corrupt or ethical, is parasitic on Black being. So what we never anticipated that this would be something that would take off. We were in graduate school, and our teacher, Derek Sexton, Zakaya Iman Jackson, myself, and others, and our teachers had written two books which we thought had paradigmatic significance. David Marriott's On Black Men, in which he's specifically talking about the violence of lynching and the intrusion of the unconscious building on Fanon, and Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, in which she's talking about the 19th century and slavery. And what I saw and Jarrett saw and other people saw is like the kernel or the grain of sand that forms the mucus around a pearl, is that what they have done is, and I would say, I don't know if that was their intention or not, but what the books had actually done, along with Patterson's book, which had interrogated certain aspects of political ontology, which everyone assumed in our political struggles, at that time were part of, we were part of the first iteration of critical resistance to abolish the prison system. We were part of a movement that was to rescind or to not let pass Prop 21 in California, which would send 14-year-old people to San Quentin. And what we're seeing is that as much as an anti-capitalist as I am, I'm not throwing Marx out with the bathwater. I teach Das Kapital, all 500 pages of it every fall to grad students in a methodology course. But these things explain Black suffering in important ways and are inadequate to explaining the essential nature of Black suffering. So we did an eminent critique of the first principles and assumptive logic of these large foundational discourses. And in that eminent critique, what we found was that all of these theorists who built on these two main master narratives, which I would argue are the foundations of all political activity, what we found was that there's a word called the human, which they all took to be organic, while at the same time, they were saying that every other category, whether it's man or woman, worker or boss, were not organic categories, they were constructed. And so we said that semiotically, that can't possibly be. There cannot possibly be a word that is phenomenologically organic or attached to a thing in a phenomenon. That simply can't happen. If that happens, then you're, if you excuse me, a religious being. It's like saying you believe in God. Okay. So I'll leave it there because you could ask me. Yeah.
I mean, that's very helpful. So the relationship between Afropessimism, as you just described it, as a kind of meta critique of those two systems, the Lacanian and the Marxist, does come across, I think, in your writings, although sometimes I thought, you get the impression that you might be saying something else. So it's not always clear to me that you think of Afropessimism as a political autonomy, a political ontology, but it's something going beyond that. It's a kind of political ontology of political ontologies.
Yeah.
The fundamental political ontology. And so those comments were very, very helpful. Well, leading directly out of that, you said so many things that are fascinating. Your talk about world making,
yes,
the capacity for world making being part of the problem that you see. Can you say more about that? There are intimations in your work where you sort of gesture to Fanon and Fanon's notion, of this kind of tabula rasa, world-destroying violence. And at least as I read them, the implication is that there's something on the other side. One would think that there would be some renewed prospect of world making. But it seems that you are reading things differently, or you don't agree with Fanon in that regard. You're not looking for a restoration or a renewed or a different kind of world making on the other side of the tabula rasa.
The honest answer to that question is I don't know. I mean, how can I put this? I believe that since '68, with Paris 1968, what you have is not just a world revolution, but you have a kind of moment in which thinking about being changes, and so Lacan, Foucault, Gramsci, and how can I put this? I believe that Blackness and slaveness are coterminous in that, unlike, and this is a big kind of scandalous conundrum within African American studies, and I would say that it has implications for how the humanities thinks its thought, and I would say that for all suffering beings except for Black beings, there is a narrative moment prior to the suffering that instantiates the being as a subject of an oppressive paradigm. There's a prior moment to the colonial situation before the French rock up in Algeria, for example. There's a prior moment to the gendered bifurcation, and Freud talks about this in a text I can't remember, but when he talks about the ways in which the infance, or to use Lacan's language, is polymorphously perverse, in the sense that there is sexuality is a construction of discourse. It is not an organic thing that evolves like blood flowing. But I don't believe that the word Black and the word Africa has a moment prior to the instantiation of social death. And this is our departure from Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, which I, for one, as Afropessimist, lean on very heavily, because what I think is extremely valuable about his work is that he does for slave studies what Antonio Gramsci and Antonio Negri did for Marxist studies. He says to the Anglo-American mind, you cannot talk about the relational dynamic by locating it empirically on the plantation, just like Negri and Gramsci said. You cannot talk about the relational dynamic of capitalist exploitation by locating it empirically in the factory. And so those are the kinds of, this is why I like these discourses and what they're trying to do, because they say all things being considered, all things being equal rather, not bringing in the movement of history, the temporality of your particular historical conjuncture, but just thinking of the paradigm as a Polaroid snapshot. What are the relational dynamics? And I think this is what Marx lays out very well in volume 1. I think this is what Lacan lays out very well in Ecrit. And, but all of those oppressed subjects within those two paradigms have a moment prior to the oppression where they had a kind of plenitude of subjectivity. And the goal is to move from that to a restoration of an ethical way of being in the world. I believe that is possible for Blackness, but here's the paradox. I don't believe it is possible to write a sentence about what that means, precisely because the antagonist within Marxism is the capitalist. And you can think about what would be an economic entity in an ethical paradigm called communism on the other side. The antagonist in the patriarchal mapping of Oedipus is man, the father. And you can think about the ways in which sexuality could transmutate and create other genders on the other side of the Oedipal triangle of mommy, daddy, me. Those paradigms are within the larger umbrella or dome of the human race. And what I am saying, what we are saying, is that for all their great insights, they have assumed that the word human is organic as opposed to constructed. And this is where they fall down and we have made an intervention. But having made that intervention, if all thought is housed under the episteme of humanness, then there will have to be a cataclysmic break or rupture in that, but you couldn't think on this side what would be on the other side of humanness. But I do believe there is another side. It's just that I don't believe that you could write a sentence about that with respect to social death. That's all. And the key thing, and I'll close right here, is that even though Kaja Silverman has written in her book, Male Subjectivity at the Margins, the first 100 pages are all about how the Gramscian theory of hegemony is right, but the base structure of political economy is wrong. She says the base structure is not the economy. That's really important, but inessential. The base structure is kinship. And Italian feminists who are part of Autonomia would counter by saying, Silverman is right, the family is innately oppressive to women, but the base structure is not of the oppression is not kinship. The base structure is capitalist, is the mode of production. So is it the mode of production or is it kinship? And what we are saying is that y'all have this blood and guts argument going on and you don't understand how you're the same type of species. In other words, you, at a meta level, both arguments suggest that people are positioned through discourse, and when they break the rules of that discourse, they experience the violence of the oppressive paradigm. And what we're saying, there's one being, borrowing from Patterson, that is first positioned by gratuitous violence. And that if that being consents, gives spontaneous consent to the hegemony of his, her, or their violence, it really doesn't matter. The violence of the slave estate acts in a gratuitous manner without thinking, without recourse or being checked by the disciplinary moves of the Foucauldian panopticon, without being checked by the spontaneous consent of Antonio Gramsci, without being checked by the submission to the place of inadequacy of the woman. In other words, there's nothing you can do as a slave to mitigate the violence of the paradigm, which makes you ontologically a different species than all those people that can be disciplined. There's no such thing as disciplining Black bodies. And this is absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary for there to be a species walking around on two legs that does not have contingent violence as its mode of being subjected. In order for all those people who are subjected by contingent violence to understand what the ontological line is between them, who they are. I am who I am, not because of my positive attributes. I am who I am because I am not Black. And so at the base of Afropessimism is the assertion that all these other theories have not theorized structural violence. They've assumed that it operates the same for everyone. Sorry, that's a long-winded way of putting it.
No, that's good for you to sort of lay all of that out. I mean, you've generated a whole series of additional questions that I'd like to ask. So, I mean, one question I continue to have and that I would like some clarity on is the relationship between slavery as a historically datable phenomenon on the one side, and slavery as, it seems, time transcendent paradigm. You seem to shuttle between those two conceptions of slavery, and I'm just not quite sure how that works.
Well, thank you. That's and I know how it works, but
Okay.
but I often have to go back to my second book to figure out what I said. So because it's very difficult. So
Right.
For me anyway, I think that there are other people who could just do it like that of my comrades in this project. So let me state it simply, and then maybe I'll be able to do it more complexly. I believe that there are two types of temporalities happening. And in Afropessimism, this book, there's no way in hell that I'm going to be able to explain all that and have it be a book for a trade publication that a junior at college can read on the bus without a dictionary. But you and I can get into this. And also, I must admit, just to be honest, the rigor of the answer to that question often leaves me when I am in a mode of creative writing, because I have to go back to a certain type of language and a certain type of mindset that was to write red, white, and black to really parse this out. So I'm going to give you the broad sweeping gesture to that, and I would hope that people would then go read Sexton, read Marriott, read even people who may or may not want to be thought of as Afropessimists, like Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask. I'm sure if Fanon were here today, he'd be nauseated by the way that, I would say to him, if you really, hey, Mr. Fanon, if you really want to understand your work, you need to read 3 books by David Marriott to understand what you said. And I think that, I think he'd be a little pissed off by that, So not everybody that we draw from wants to be known as an Afropessimist, but I also think that a lot of this has to do with people suffering from what I call, what in the State Department they tell ambassadors it's a disease of clientitis, where someone is posted to a country for such a long time that they become in love with the country and in love with the people, that they forget that their job is to project American interests on this soil, not to hear the voices of the people where they are. And what I think is that oftentimes we get involved, Fanon wants to solve this problem, the problem of his wife's superiority complex, and the problem of, as a category, white people, right, and the problem of his own hallucinatory whitening. And he suffers from clientitis because what he doesn't understand is that his wife lives in a zone of violence that cannot be reconciled with his zone of violence. And so he then suffers these kind of impasses in the book, which I find productive, but he doesn't go beyond, because he thinks that talking and communication can solve this between the two of them. Now, your thing on time and paradigm. I would say that there are two temporalities that I'm shuttling between. One is the temporality of the paradigm, so that paradigms themselves are not eternal. The paradigm of global capitalism, I was just listening to Richard Wolff the other day, is no more than 300 to 400 years old. It saturates the globe. You can't go anywhere in the world without being subjected to the capitalist relation. However, there was a time before the time of capitalism. So there are these huge chunks of time in which massive amounts of violence happens to instantiate a completely new relational mode. And then within that paradigm, you have another kind of temporality. And I would, just for shorthand, I'd call that temporality history. Now I'm going to depart from Patterson to answer your question directly. Patterson would say that that slavery is something that every social formation has been subjected to. So every social formation has been subjected to social death. And he talks about, say, the Choctaw enslaving people prior to Columbus. He talks about civil servants in, I think it was the Ming Dynasty, who walked around in the long flowing robes just like everyone else, were not chattel, but they were slaves, they were socially dead. So he says, going back thousands of years and across the globe, everyone has experienced slavery and everyone has imposed slavery. And I would say that is also true with the Ashanti, the Buganda, and other people prior to 625 AD. But when 625 AD rocks up, in my view, something else happens. And this is that a word which is not a cultural word in the way that worker is not a cultural word. Inside of the word worker, you have hundreds of thousands of cultural and ethnic identities. But worker and capitalist are paradigmatic designative bifurcations in a paradigm, and they have identities within that. And so the first thing is, I would argue that, and I haven't done this work myself, but I've read it, and I have graduate students who from the Middle East who are doing this work. So I want to acknowledge that this is not my original labors. But this word Black is not organic to a cultural modality. It is elaborated through a global consensus that Africa is a carceral cartography and Africa is a place of slaves. And that, I would say, is very different than one part of Patterson's argument, in which he says that slavery is the same structurally, however one is recruited into slavery. So the first part, 100% agree with. Slavery is the same, whether you're in chains, whether you're sitting on a couch eating bonbons, whether you're a civil servant in a Chinese dynasty, slavery is the same in the same way that capitalism is the same for a sweatshop worker who is dying in a maquiladora and for a highly exalted professor in Sweden. capitalism is the same. The lived experience of the sweatshop worker and the professor in Stockholm is radically different, but the mode of subjugation is absolutely the same. So we're there. Slavery is the same. Social death, the three elements: general dishonor, alienation, and gratuitous violence. But what we would argue is that there is no recruitment into social death for Blackness. And this is where the narrative arc that even Patterson allows for is disallowed for within Afropessimism. There's no narrative arc because there's no prior moment and there's no process of recruitment. And that for me is pretty heavy. That for me is pretty heavy, that you've got the Iranians, people who would become Iranians, people who would become Arabs, people who would become East Indians, people who would become Moroccan Jews, people who would become East Indians, all agreeing that Blackness and slaveness are the same and that there's no moment of recruitment. There's nothing prior to that. And so that for me is a paradigmatic instantiation. It's not a historical one. Inside the paradigm, there is history, but I don't believe that the historical changes in Black life, from the Arab slave trade from 625 AD to handing it over to the Portuguese in the 1500s, I don't believe that those very real experiential changes are changes in the structures of Black relationality.
That's very useful. I think that probably the inverse of what you said would also be true, could be true, and that is that there's a paradigm within history, so that somehow within the historical processes of Black enslavement, a conception of slavery as paradigmatically Black emerged, and it sort of gobbled up the histories. That's sort of what I hear you saying.
Yeah, I mean, Blackness makes something of social death that was never there before.
Right. So the trouble with humans. So, sort of let's sort of extend this a little, more.
Okay.
So you talk about human not being organic, being a construction, no doubt about it. We could also say that the concept of species, the concept of Homo sapiens is a construction. But I mean, wouldn't you agree that there's construction and then there's construction? And not all forms of construction occur at the same level. I get the sense in your account that you want to sort of flatten out any differences that there might be, that we might take there to be between person, human, and Homo sapien. And I mean, I see a little bit, I think you sort of, raise this point yourself, whether or not you should actually use the word people, in reference to Blacks. And so could you just say a little bit about the relationship among those terms and whether or not you think that the construction involved in those terms occur at the same level?
I don't necessarily understand. Initially, I would just say I don't think they occur at the same level. I mean, I would never be one to say that, just like I made the point about the maquiladora worker and the professor in Stockholm, I would never be one to say, therefore, there should not be a lot of research on what it means to suffer as a maquiladora worker. Therefore, there should not be a lot of research on the kinds of intra-working class privilege of a professor in Stockholm, and we should not do that. All I'm saying is that I'm a one-note Johnny, okay? And I've got one, personally, not other Afropessists, I've got one thing, to give the world. And this is large schematizing interventions, precisely because I think that where I am in the United States of America, that there's a pedagogic hobble in which so many of my students and so many of my colleagues deal on these micro levels and talk about hybridity. And there's so much optimism about possibility. And I think if I can give one thing to the world, it's the lack of optimism about all this possibility. It's the keeping our nose to the grindstone of the mission to destroy paradigms, not live better within them. There are people who, we need people who do that. You know, we need Black psychologists, we need social work, we need all kinds of, we need people working in Black Lives Matter to deal with the immediacy of police brutality, but that's not part of my contribution. My contribution is not how to investigate the vagaries between species, but to say that capacity comes with its principles. Capacity comes with its assumptive logic, and we have to interrogate capacity as a generic mode of being, even while other people are working on how to live better or the different modes within capacity. And so if I, if I were a professor of chess and writing books, and you say, what is there at one end of the spectrum, there are books about, say, Bobby Fischer and his great chess matches against the Russian, and there are books about different chess games in history, and there are books about strategies of chess. And then way at the other end of the spectrum are these static books, which is simply describing the temporality and spatiality of chess before any move is made. Before any move is made. In other words, what is the topography of the chessboard? Okay, a deep investigation of that. And then what are the power capacities of each piece, the pawn, the rook, the queen. And so, and this is what I appreciate about the first part of the first half of Das Kapital, because he's saying, I don't want to hear at this moment about how capitalism works in the world. I simply want to tell you, all things being equal, how is capacity for value constructed? And I really think that that's the kind of thinking that is so anathema to Anglo-American discourse that it needs to be hammered home. So I'm really talking about the capacity to be versus the absence of the capacity to be, which is not to poo-poo the differences within that, but I also think that there's a political payoff for the kind of thing that I'm doing. And the political payoff is that, which I had never expected, and I don't think Jared Sexton or anyone expected that, because all we were trying to do was gain some space for us in graduate school, in these Gramsci seminars, these Marx seminars, and these psychoanalytic seminars to say, yeah, I can see how that works, but you still haven't explained Black suffering, essentially. But what happened was that Michael Brown was killed, and then Sandra Bland died. And so why this is connecting in the world is because this is the one discourse that Black youth, people from like 12 to 25, and then after that you're a failure until you hit 65, okay, and Black old people can get to without having to be disciplined by that voice from the political sphere saying, okay, so where's that gonna get us? So what's going to happen on the other side? Or what are our goals? No, this is simply a discourse of analysis that gives permission, because it listens to the cry of Blackness in pain, and gives permission for that expression in any wildfire way that it comes about, without having to channel that into a coherent set of projects. And so that's all I want to do.
No, I think it comes across in your writing. So as I've thought about what you've done and are doing and trying to put it, you don't have to agree, but this is how I see you. I see you as a provocateur. I think you're very invested in provoking. I see you as a kind of performance artists. And there was one other term that I wanted that I've sort of, yeah, and I hope you take this in the right way. I see you as operating rhetorically in what I would call a hyperbolic register. And I think a hyperbolic and a categorical register, and I think that you operate there precisely for the reasons that you just described. I think that your description of yourself as being a Johnny One Note, I mean, one great ideal is all that it takes. Most of us never have that. And so I can see how pursuing that idea would make certain kinds of, rhetorical and argumentative, strategies. So I see you simultaneously being a meticulous analyst, but also being a kind of provocateur and performance artist who's working in this kind of hyperbolic and categorical register, which does get people's attention. I mean, I don't know what you think of that account, but
yeah.
In any event, I find your work to be quite fascinating. It's one of those ideas that has taken not just the Black Academy, but really the critical theory academy by storm. I think it's made its way outside of the academy into intellectual sites, outside the university. And I just find that fascinating, and which is one of the reasons why there's a chapter in my upcoming book on your work. So again, looking at your work, I see you making three sort of meta claims.
Okay.
And the first meta claim is that the human is founded on anti-Black solidarity between first-class humans, white, second-class humans, all non-Black people. The second meta claim I hear you making is that in terms of political ontology, there's a fundamental chasm between humans and non-humans, between Black people as non-humans and everybody else. And then the third meta claim I hear you making, I think this is probably the one where there's probably the most pushback, and that is that anti-Blackness is a problem without a solution, which is partly where my question about world-making capacity on the other side of a tabula rasa comes from. I think that it's probably that sense of, for lack of a better term, hopelessness. And I don't, I'm critical of the language of hope, but I think that that's probably where the most pushback will come. I think there are probably many critical thinkers who can sort of find ways of reconciling themselves to the claim that Blacks aren't human. But the notion that there's no other side, or even your kind of Foucauldian allergy to talking about the possibility of another side, this fear that to talk about the other side in the language and categories that we have now is going to somehow just not misunderstand what it might be, but somehow contaminate it or undermine the prospect of another side. I see all of that at work in what you say.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I there is a solution. There is another side. The solution is called the end of the world. And the other, but the end of the world cannot be narrativized if narrative is not an organic kind of entity, if narrative is a construction. I mean, we know that narrative arcs are a product of capitalist accumulation. You can see it in the formation of the novel, and you can see it in the formation of music when you move from how do you get from Baroque music, which just goes, without an arc, to Mozart, which is a journey of individual, plenitude, loss, and then reconstitution to Beethoven, who really makes it, what it is. You get there because a bunch of people called the bourgeoisie launched a bunch of slave ships, got some money, then got some guns, and launched a revolution against the aristocracy, and then boom, moved the ecclesiastics, kicked the ecclesiastics to the curb, and instantiated their own organic intellectuals. I mean, so thinking is not a function like blood. It actually is a product of revolutionary violence, thinking itself. And so to think outside the category of feudal duality between peasant and lord and into a new category, you had to have a cataclysmic revolution that instantiated a new paradigm. To think outside the category of human versus Black, you're going to need the same thing. But what is different about that process is really the difference can be found in like the first principles of semiotics, which I think that Afropessimism interrogates through eminent critique. In other words, there's a way in which the value of, as I said before, May 68 and all that comes after that is that it says that there's a kind of, it brings about a kind of hopelessness first, that everyone is positioned through discourse in a paradigm that exceeds and anticipates you. So there's an ultrasound done on the mother's belly, and you see a penis, and all of a sudden, a world opens that is waiting. Blue rooms, names like Bill and Frank, dreams that the infants will be instantiated into. Okay, that paradigm is saying that when this baby gets past 18 months, it will become no longer an infans, but become a subject of relationality through its discursive location. That's the bad news. But the good news for those discourses is that it can work through semiotic instruments. Perhaps you would call this counter-hegemonic war of position. Feminists might call it something else, to change the names and change the ideas to something else and produce a counter-hegemonic move that will ultimately lead to a violent revolution that will bring about new structural positions. What we're saying is that Blackness does not enter the paradigm like that. It enters the paradigm as the opposite of those people with capacity. And that discursive capacity is what we call world making. That's whether you're Marxist or a Lacanian or a Zizek, like both together. And what it means is that, I just lost my thread, but is that there's a word in the symbolic order, a word / concept that doesn't operate like other words and concepts. In other words, the reason that you get the optimism, the revolutionary optimism in, say, Lacanian feminism or Marxist political theory is because one can, at least like we say back in the day, free your mind and your ass will follow, right? I mean, all those discourses are saying is once you begin to work intellectually on the paradigm, then you change your attitude and then you spread out and you have this counter-hegemonic move which destroys the historical blocks and a new historical block gets formed, and then you move on the capitalist class. But what we're suggesting is that the reason that could happen is because no words are fixed. However, there is one word that is fixed. And I would argue that it is the N word in its elaboration. Why is it fixed? Why does the N word not come with this capacity that in semiotics called endless commutability? Endless commutability means that every word has the capacity to mean something else. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you could take a word like a derogatory word for Latino or a derogatory word for gay person, and through revolutionary counter-hegemonic moves, begin to reappropriate that word for something positive and then move on the system that created something negative. But the N word marks a being that is not placed in the paradigm through discourse as the first move. Marks a being that is placed in the paradigm through gratuitous violence. And as Patterson says in the first chapter, the interesting thing about the paradigm of the slave estate is that once you and I as Black people just accede, just agree, we're going to be good Negroes, that matters if we are not Black. We then become Foucauldian disciplined subjects. We then become, in psychoanalysis, properly Oedipalized subjects. We then become, in Marxist analysis, good workers who will not go on strike. You cannot be good paradigmatically and Black. You cannot create a strategy for being safe and being good in the paradigm. And this is the problem with slave narratives, as I put out in the book, and the problem of anti-police brutality organizing. We have to understand that violence against Black people is not a form of discriminatory actions. Violence against Black people is an ensemble of necessary rituals that produce therapeutic balm, B-A-L-M, for the rest of the human race. And that is, and there's no transformation to something else within that paradigm. The paradigm of worldness has to be destroyed, and then there'll be something on the other side. But you can't say what it is inside the episteme that you're in. That would be my argument.
Well, I think with that disquisition on the N word, that this might be a good place to bring this conversation to an end. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I think you've deepened my understanding of Afropessimism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bill. Good to meet you virtually. I hope to come back to the hometown to shake your hand.
Thank you for visiting our video. I'm Beth Cleary.
I'm Peter Ratcliffe, and this is Orso, the library dog.
We are the co-founders and co-executive directors of the East Side Freedom Library in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. If you enjoy our programming and want to support our work, please visit our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org.